The Metroidvania genre is one that I've always quite enjoyed and appreciated, but never become fully immersed in. A major reason for this is probably that it's not a genre I actually grew up with at all. In fact, even now, the only Castlevania game I've ever played is Symphony of the Night, a game which I did enjoy but certainly never grew to love. And then as far as the Metroid games go, I've never played a single one. It's not that I have anything against the Metroid series or anything, it's just that I've never seen one. I mean that literally too, I've never seen a physical copy of a Metroid game. I might be completely wrong here, and may the grievous miracle punish me if I am, but I don't think series like Castlevania, Metroid and Mega Man quite took hold across Europe and the UK the way they did in Japan and North America. So they never really influenced my gaming palette in the way that other popular Japanese series did, like Final Fantasy and Pokemon, etc. Now that I think about it, I only tried my first Metroidvania a few years ago, with Salt and Sanctuary being my first foray into the genre. Decent enough game, released back in the days where Souls-likes were still really rare, as opposed to nowadays, where they're everywhere and they're all the bloody same. But let's stay on track. My second Metroidvania would have been Hollow Knight. I'm not even going to talk about how much of a killer game Hollow Knight is, because yeah, everyone knows, it's sick. Then, what would have been my third Metroidvania back in 2019 was a very interesting game indeed. It was one with fairly basic but solid mechanics, one with a respectable but not outrageous difficulty curve. It was not, however, the movement, the difficulty, or the combat mechanics which caused this particular game to strike such a chord in the gaming world. No, it was the visuals, the atmosphere, the music, and the unique ultra-religious setting which really got people talking. This is Blasphemous, one of the most disturbing and interesting games I've ever played. First things first, I'm going to introduce the world of Blasphemous and its protagonist, then I'll discuss the various elements which make this game what it is, before circling back and covering the game's cryptic but fascinating plot. Blasphemous takes place in the fictitious land of Custodia. Although many of Custodia's locations and customs take a good bit of influence from the real world, it is ultimately a fictional place, giving the developers a good bit of creative freedom regarding how this world is depicted. And good God, what a grim depiction. For an indeterminate amount of time, the land of Custodia has been at the mercy of a mysterious holy phenomenon known only as the miracle. What is the miracle? No one knows for sure, and in fact it's a force which is considered impossible for mere man to unravel. Although it's not known what the miracle actually is, or what it wants, everyone in Custodia is all too aware of what it does. The best and most defining example of an act of the miracle is the tale of the Twisted One, also known as the Father, also known as the first son of the miracle. The Twisted One was said to have prayed and prayed for punishment, seating himself next to a wooden log while he prayed for the pain which he believed his guilt-racked soul deserved. After a time, roots from the log began to stretch and twist all over his body, causing great pain to the young man, who uttered not a single word of complaint. This young man, twisted and deformed, was thereafter known as the first son of the miracle. The miracle, an incomprehensible holy body, which from that point on began to manifest itself all throughout the bodies and souls of the people of Custodia, usually in cruel and grotesque ways. Another example of a manifestation of the miracle is that of Nacimiento, who has the face of an old man growing out of his chest, while he himself is gradually growing younger. Why is this happening to him? It's impossible to know. We can guess, and he can guess, but the paths and ways of the miracle are twisted, and aren't there to be understood. Efforts by Nacimiento to slow or halt his punishment are to no avail, as his morbid yet holy condition progresses. Another victim of the miracle, one of countless many mind you, is Quirce, who upon being sentenced to death by burning at the hands of the Inquisition, proceeded to rematerialise after dying of the flames, being brought back to life from the ashes only to burn again and again in endless suffering and penance. As we, the player, explore the land of Custodia, we discover example after example of similar such acts of the miracle, with most of them involving some dreadful, disturbing, involuntary display of religious devotion, agonising exhibitions of guilt and penance. Rather than the people of Custodia regarding the miracle as being a force to be reviled and feared, however, it is instead the subject of worship. Rather than the tale of the Twisted One being one to inspire horror, such stories result in near impossible levels of religious zealotry from men, women and children. Acts of great suffering, be they voluntary or not, are held in the highest regard, a thing to aspire to, a thing to emulate. Everyone in Custodia is afflicted with an intense guilt, just as the Twisted One was when he begged for punishment, for agony, for the miracle. The protagonist of Blasphemous is the Penitent One, who at no point in the entire game utters a single word, being a part of the Brotherhood of the Silent Sorrow, who hold the silence of the Twisted One in the highest possible reverence, themselves choosing to take on the penance of silence for their entire lives, in tribute to their twisted father. Like pretty much everyone in Custodia, the Penitent One finds himself in unspeakably morbid conditions, waking up amidst mounds of naked bodies, dead brothers and sisters of the Silent Sorrow. The Penitent One, however, is alive, having been revived by the miracle. As for why, that is indiscernible at this point. All the Penitent One can do is carry out his penance, journeying through the cursed land of Custodia, armed with the holy relic sword, Mea Culpa. We actually see Mea Culpa being birthed in this game's fantastic opening cutscene, whereupon a nameless woman repeatedly pounds a small statue of the Twisted Father into her chest, begging for punishment in feverish tribute to the father, until a sword takes form from the base of the statue, impaling her body but giving rise to a holy weapon. A weapon said to be capable of somehow taking on the rampant guilt of all peoples of Custodia, now wielded by the Penitent One, who may or may not become a custodian of guilt. For now, I'd say that was a sufficient introduction to Custodia and our protagonist. The main thing I want to get across is that the world of Blasphemous is an extremely damaged and disturbed one. When it comes to religious acts, nothing is done in moderation here. Devotion and worship are often as appalling as possible, and suffering is seen as a noble and good thing. The miracle has left its mark on Custodia, and as we journey through the land, we see its traces everywhere. Gameplay wise, Blasphemous is actually fairly simple. It's a 2D Metroidvania, so most of its core movement will be easy enough to get a grip for most. Although the setting is very distinct and extreme, the actual gameplay mechanics aren't. This isn't a bad thing, I actually really like the way Blasphemous feels, but don't come into this expecting anything too revolutionary from the mechanics. You can move left or right, drop down to lower platforms, jump, slide, and, for some vertical surfaces, dig your sword into the wall, allowing for a little bit of respite before attempting another jump. You'll have the ability to do all this right from the get-go, and you'll actually be able to get to the end of the game without ever having to do anything more complex than that. Something which I found really interesting about Blasphemous though, and maybe a little odd, is that you do unlock some more movement options throughout the game. It's just that they're all totally optional, with their only use being to open up areas that are themselves totally optional. At certain points, the Penitent One will come across certain items, some of which are seemingly quite mundane. These can be blessed, however, and then equipped as relics, allowing access to previously inaccessible areas. Now, these items don't actually unlock more movement options, strictly speaking. You won't be getting a double jump in this game, or an air dash, but, for example, there's a relic that will allow you to travel through areas filled with poison gas unharmed, or one that causes previously invisible blood platforms to materialise in front of you. My main point is that the movement in Blasphemous is mostly pretty tame, but fun. There's a ton of platforming, often over grisly spike pits or death pits into nothing, and you'll certainly be busy avoiding lots of projectiles from enemies while you're leaping from ladder to ladder, but there's no Hollow Knight levels of fuckery here. The world of Blasphemous is a pretty damn good size and is exactly as big as it needed to be. You've got a map too, which gradually fills up as you explore different areas, so you'll never get too lost. The game also allows for custom markers to be placed if you come across any sections of levels that you can't get to yet, which is always nice. The placement of the game's many different levels also never feels random, being connected to each other in logical ways. Each level feels completely unique too. There's really not a single general area where I thought, meh, they didn't have to include this bit. Although they did add in an extra area as part of the free Wounds of Eventide update back in late 21. Jesus Christ, this part is about 10 times more difficult than any other area in the game. Something which really makes the level stand out is the various mechanics they introduce, usually tied to the general theme of the area. For example, found at the highest point in Custodia is the Convent of Our Lady of the Charred Visage. As you might have guessed from the name, burning is a central theme of this area, and so you'll be timing jumps in between streams of burning lava, controlled by mutilated nuns behind masks of gold worn to hide their weeping facial sores. Then there's the Mother of Mothers, the massive central church of Custodia. This level has just as much verticality as it has horizontality. Swinging incense censers swing back and forth, punishing the reckless player who ill-times their jump. And then you enter this room. See, shit like this is why I love this game. Behold yet another terrifying manifestation of the miracle. As you can see, it's not restricted to manifesting within people alone, but also objects, great and small, and even the landscape itself. As a recent victim of the censor tells us from beyond. How many more prayers does the censor want? When will it tire and stop swinging? When will we be able to stand again? Lower your head, close your eyes, pray, and do not get up. Other areas have their own unique characteristics too. It's not just the same shit, but with a different background. No, these areas have a feel, a presence. Graveyard of the Peaks requires you to time your movements and jumps to when the wind is blowing in a favourable direction. And the Wall of the Holy Prohibitions is the only area in the game which has you travelling back and forth through doors, looking for more keys so as to unlock the way through more doors to proceed through the level. What I'm trying to highlight is that there's not just the water level, or the fire area, or the castle area, or whatever. The levels in this game all play a part. I'm not just talking about the world being interconnected, which it certainly is to a degree, but I mean the stories, history and presence of this game's weird, disturbing, but often beautiful levels all serves to convey a feeling, an inimitable one, a unique and unmatched atmosphere. The mechanics used to actually navigate your way through these levels aren't outstanding by themselves, but the world itself as a whole is outstanding on multiple levels, something which becomes more and more clear as you travel around this world's crazed locations, discovering secrets and bearing witness to the acts of the grievous miracle. The player has a good degree of freedom in how they want to tackle the game too. For example, after reaching the wasteland of the buried churches area, you could go up in the direction of the Graveyard of the Peaks, or down and right to Mercy Dreams, or down and left until you reach the Great Bell of Jondo. Similarly, in the second half of the game, it does much the same thing and gives the player 3 more general directions to travel in, not to mention the optional areas, and optional sections of critical path areas. Got to be a bit careful with this game though because of the additional ending added as per the Wounds of Eventide update. Before the update there were just 2 endings, but the update added a new one, now considered the canon ending. Trouble is, you can fuck yourself out of this ending if you progress too far without first completing several easily missable steps. If you do plan on coming back to this game and going for the 3rd ending, do yourself a favour and look up a step-by-step guide first. With this being a Metroidvania, at least I think it's a Metroidvania. Maybe it's not. I don't know. Who gives a fuck? With this being a Metroidvania, there's also a ton of combat, and again, the mechanics on offer here aren't too complex, though the player is given a decent enough range of options as they progress through the game from beginning to end. Before I get into how combat works, I think it would be a good idea to explain what it is the Penitent One actually fights throughout the game. But to do that, got to delve a little bit more into Custodia's history. Just like in games like Dark Souls and Elden Ring, Blasphemous is pretty meagre when it comes to detailed information on actual timelines. We know the rough order of key events, but not how long any of them actually lasted, or even if time works the same way here as it does in our world. But what we do know is that Custodia has its own version of the Pope, known as His Holiness Escribar, whose job it was to interpret the miracle for the benefit of his congregation. For one reason or another, however, Escribar arrived at the notion that the miracle had abandoned the people of Custodia, and so as a result, he turned his throne away from his congregation, bringing about the age of the turned throne. At some point later, and we don't know how long, Escribar's body began to transform into a tree. His skin turned to bark, he grew branches from his arms and body, and his blood turned to sap. Escribar grew and grew into a massive tree, towering over the church, until one day the tree ignited in a fire which blazed for 90 days. Due to the size of the tree, however, an inordinate amount of ash was created, creating mountains of it. His underlings and congregation at the Mother of Mothers all attempted to run up the pile of ash, so as to claim Escribar's position as His Holiness, the one who supposedly communed with the miracle. However, as they attempted to climb, one by one, those that hungered after his power sank deeper and deeper into the ash. They did not remain in the ash, however, rising up out of it, filling the air with broken animalistic howls and cries, their bodies twisted and mutilated into impossible forms, new manifestations of the miracle, infected with a pure, holy rage, intent on punishing those who escaped the influence of the miracle, just as they themselves could not. These are the punished. And that, my friends, is why Custodia is crawling with monstrosities intent on spreading punishment. Although Blasphemous has a lot of bosses, most of whom actually have at least a lore entry or two dedicated to them, the regular enemies remain almost entirely unexplained. I mean, we know that they are all of the hordes which rose out of Escribar's ash pile, but that's all we know. And so when we encounter men literally split down the middle, or masked nuns carrying massive urns filled with body parts, don't expect an explanation. I think Blasphemous literally has some of the best enemy designs of any game I've ever played. They're just so fucked up and disturbing. They're a constant reminder of what a terrifying force the miracle really is, with its incomprehensibility only adding to that horror. As for the combat mechanics, the Penitent one starts off with a 3-hit combo, with the last hit of course doing the most damage. You can also attack up, and you can duck or attack while jumping, both of which play important roles in avoiding many attacks, particularly with bosses. Just like in Dark Souls, you've got a certain number of healing flasks which can be upgraded, and there's also a surprisingly wide range of prayers to find and choose from, acting as magic in this game. Combat here, although simple, is quite precise, and hitboxes actually matter. The slide is one of the most useful techniques for avoiding damage, as some attacks can be avoided by simply sliding through the enemy, though there's also a parry. Nearly every attack in this game can actually be parried, although depending on the ferocity of the enemy's attack, parrying sometimes only serves as just another method to avoid damage, whereas other attacks, once parried, are automatically followed up with a counter-attack. If the player presses the attack button again just as the counter-attack connects, it'll do extra damage as shown by a lightning bolt effect which passes through the enemy, sometimes stunning the enemy and allowing for an execution. Now obviously Blasphemous is a dark game, maybe one of the darkest I've ever played, but it's also a brutally violent one. Although not every enemy has its own execution animation, most do. This wasn't actually the case upon the game's initial release, but the devs gradually added in more finisher animations with free updates after. Pretty cool. Most of these are frankly gratuitous and disgusting, but satisfying, not to mention beautifully drawn. Sometimes I can't help but laugh when watching these though. It's that laugh where you see something so fucked up that it reaches above a certain threshold and becomes funny, in a way. Parries don't always lead to these finisher executions, but a lot of the times they do, and honestly parries really aren't difficult to pull off in this game. The timing is pretty damn generous, and excluding the bosses, regular enemies really don't have a wide range of attacks. In fact, now that I think of it, most enemies only really have one attack, so once you get them down, they tend not to pose too much of a challenge. To be honest, difficulty is kind of weird in Blasphemous. I think it did kind of get a reputation as being a bit of a hardcore game when it first came out, but it really isn't. No, it's not easy and you will die, but it's not that tough. I say this because the game gives you an excessive number of ways to modify the Penitent One's stats by equipping different rosary beads, not to mention upgrades for your sword, health, fervour and health flasks. Then there's all the different prayers, some of which are super powerful, although admittedly these aren't easy to find. After you've upgraded your shit a bit, coming back to the early parts of the game poses no challenge. I guess some people do like that though, the feeling of struggling early on before coming back after you've upgraded your stuff to flatten those enemies which gave you trouble before. Although at its core combat is pretty basic, there are some extra moves to unlock, purchasable through various mea culpa shrines, which are hidden all throughout Custodia. Finding a new shrine will upgrade your damage, but also unlock the option to buy some really effective new attacks, like the dash thrust, the downward slam, and some extra powerful combo finishers. These new attacks don't really increase the complexity of the combat to any meaningful degree, but they definitely make stuff easier, and you'll be using these attacks a lot, especially the ranged attack, which is literally a lifesaver. As sick and twisted as the regular enemies are though, it's the bosses where things get more challenging, not to mention horrific. Just as with the regular enemies, there are a lot of truly bizarre designs here, and there will likely be times where you're not even entirely sure what it is you're fighting. The early bosses really aren't so tough, like 10 Piedad or Trey Augustus, but they're challenging enough and can certainly cause more than a few deaths before you finally nail their movesets. Again though, the bosses aren't super complex, you probably won't be fighting them for hours desperately trying to remember every move and every counter, although the bosses towards the end of the game certainly do get tougher. I'm thinking of Chrysanta and Escribar. And then there's the two optional Wounds of Eventide bosses, which truly are about 10 times more difficult than anything from the base game. It's kinda jarring actually. See, if you're diligent in exploring the levels for items and upgrades, by the end you'll be very strong, so much so that you can kinda trivialise a lot of enemies and bosses, even in later areas. However, if you want to go for the secret ending added in the Wounds of Eventide update, you've got to fight a couple of new bosses and they're a serious challenge. The Serpent boss, Sierpes, isn't actually too bad, it just has an absurd amount of health, probably too much to be honest. Still, as with literally everything in Blasphemous, very cool design. Isadora on the other hand fucking sucks. Again, very cool, especially the way she sings throughout the whole fight, I love all that, but something just didn't sit right with me for this boss. The timings for parrying a lot of her attacks were just weird, and I'd often find myself just getting hit again and again every time I got up, making for a really frustrating fight. I don't know, maybe I'm just being a salty bitch, but I didn't enjoy this boss too much, whereas I enjoyed the hell out of all the bosses in the base game. Still, all those items and upgrades you'll have been collecting along the way really do feel important for these bosses, whereas they can kind of feel unnecessary for the regular bosses. You can really steamroll a lot of them. Even Exposito, who I know a lot of people really struggled with, really isn't that difficult if you just go in prepared, with a decent prayer equipped. You know what though, who even gives a fuck about the mechanics of the boss? How incredibly interesting are these designs? This is the shit that really caught people's attention. There's a video right now up on YouTube just showing someone playing through every boss, and it has nearly 9 million views, and for good reason. I don't know how the artists over at the Game Kitchen came up with this stuff, but I'm glad they did. It's weird, disturbing, and it makes you want to know more about these tortured entities and about the miracle which caused them. Thankfully, there are often snippets of information about the bosses, and as you'd expect, they're very well written. Let me read an example about Exposito, Scion of Abjuration, on screen now. The big baby. When she was to be taken to the campfire, the Inquisitors took the baby from her arms, and she screamed, begging for the child to not see her burn. The boy who stared at her from afar, drenched in tears, was blindfolded. The blindfold was immediately moistened. The bonfire was surrounded by people, there to see the execution. They screamed, calling her a witch and a heretic. When the flames started licking the pile of firewood, she asked a kind figure to build a wicker figure in her image and size, and to place her child in its arms so the baby would not miss her. And so they did. When the figure was built, they placed the bawling child in its arms, and the orphan immediately stopped crying. The miracle was merciful once again. Then there's also a little bit more to go on with this. The little one stopped crying as soon as we placed him in the arms of that wicker woman, as if it were his mother. Sometimes I can't help but think there's something living in that wicker. Sometimes it seems to be rocking him in the darkness. I'd like to talk now about the many collectibles scattered all around Blasphemous' world. If you're the kind of person who likes games with tons of hidden items and secrets and magics and more, you'll love Blasphemous. There are rosary beads, relics, quest items, mea culpa hearts, prayers, and also collectible bones from the bodies of various holy figures through time, scattered all around Custodia. Then on top of that, there are also 46 children of moonlight hidden throughout the world. There's a frankly ridiculous amount of stuff to find here, and I love it. It all serves a purpose too. You're not just collecting stuff for its own sake. For example, rosary beads act as accessories, providing the penitent one with a range of passive abilities, things like increasing the strength of prayers, or imbuing him with invulnerability while healing, and many more. Although you only start with one free slot for these, you can upgrade this and equip as many as 8 by the end of the game. It's worthwhile swapping out different combos of rosary beads too, depending on what you're fighting. Then there's relics, which I mentioned briefly before. These basically allow you to reach previously inaccessible areas, thus allowing you to find even more hidden shit to work towards 100% completion. As for quest items, you'll be finding a lot of them, because Blasphemous has a whole bunch of really great side quests to get stuck into. Also, I should mention almost every item in the game has a separate lore page to go along with it, serving as enjoyable nuggets of info to help piece together the story and to provide more insight into the game's locations and bosses. We've also got mea culpa hearts, which you can equip while resting at checkpoints. Like rosary beads, these provide passive buffs, but more powerful ones, and so they also come with a negative effect. To be honest, I'd say mea culpa hearts are probably the most superfluous of all the game's item types. Some of them are useful, but I usually never paid too much mind to which one I had equipped at any one time. Next, there's prayers, which are basically magic. A cool touch with these is that if you check the lore entry for each one, they literally are prayers. There's loads of prayers in the game, and they're usually very well hidden, or act as rewards for completing side quests. Some of these are powerful as hell, especially when combined with the right rosary beads, and you can really melt through boss health bars, with a personal favourite of mine being Devla of the Lights. How could you not love that? Lastly, there's the 44 bones scattered all throughout Custodia. While these don't have a direct benefit and can't be equipped or anything, they are part of a side quest within the ossuary under the village of Albero, and are also necessary to find if you're really interested in fighting Isadora. The funny thing is that you really need to work to find all this shit. On my first playthrough of Blasphemous, I remember getting to the end, cycling through my inventory, and being confused as hell at all the empty spaces. I'd found just a tiny fraction of the game's beads, hearts and prayers, but didn't understand how I could have passed so many of them by. Well yeah, it turns out you can easily pass them by. A sizable percentage of hidden items are only accessible if you found the right relics, which themselves tend to be locked behind side quests, all of which are completely optional. On subsequent playthroughs, I really made an effort to find absolutely everything and get the Platinum Trophy on PlayStation, and I would 100% recommend others do the same. I had so much fun doing it, and the world is dense with secret areas and items that can all be completely missed. Scouring every area of all its secrets feels very enjoyable and rewarding because of how well designed they are. I guess now I should talk about the graphics and sound. To be honest, these are always the hardest things for me to talk about with games. Sometimes it feels like I'm just desperately trying to find different ways of saying, it's great, I love it. But regardless, we have to talk about the game's art style. It's great, I love it. The pixelated style lends itself perfectly to the ultra-religious aesthetic. Both characters, enemies and the levels really just pop out at you. All this is complemented perfectly by the sound. The soundtrack itself is incredible and super memorable, but even aside from the music, some areas just have an ambience about them that makes them all the more disturbing to play through. Blasphemous truly is the most disturbing game I've ever played, more so than any proper horror game. Seriously, some of the areas really fuck me up. The ambience of the Mountains of Endless Dusk in particular, gets me. See what you think. Then there's other areas which, although still stark and frightening, actually manage to hit a strong emotional chord. An example of this is the Graveyard of the Peaks level. The game also has a few cutscenes sprinkled throughout. There aren't tons of them, but again they look slick as hell. The opening cutscene in particular, where we see our sword, Mea Culpa, being gruesomely brought into existence, does a perfect job at setting the grim tone of the whole game. Now, there is an aspect of this game which, in my opinion, is not so good, highlighted all the more because of how stellar nearly everything else is, and that's some of the voice acting. It's absolutely not all bad, and I actually really like the way some of the characters deliver their lines, like Deo Gracias.
I am Deo Gracias, witness to and narrator of the acts of the grievous miracle. But
then there's other characters which simply sound bad. The main culprit I'm thinking of here is Redento. He's a member of the Genuflecting Pilgrims, a group who travel through Custodia always with their back bent and their eyes to the ground. Great character and all, with a really cool questline, but he sounds like this.
The Master showeth us the continuation of the path. New steps await us under the cold stone. O penitent one, we traverse strange roads under the same firmament, with nigh other trade, nigh other name.
I really don't like to be mean, but that just sounds so bad, dude. There's other examples too of voice acting which just sounds off.
With this veil, I cover my face in mourning for the dead love for my betrothed.
Of course, the devs are actually Spanish, so I'm sure it sounds way better with the original Spanish voice acting, but it's just a shame the English dub wasn't really up to scratch. The devs clearly agreed to, at least partially, because they literally redid the English voice acting for the character of Chrysanta. The original voice acting was shocking. There's a before and after video up on YouTube, so please check it out. It's funny. While we're on the subject of things about the game that I'm not crazy about, I'd like to bring up another free update the devs gave us back in early 2021. The Bloodstained Crossover. I'll be up front here, I don't really give a shit about Bloodstained. I don't dislike it or anything, I just don't care about it. And furthermore, I don't like the idea of a crossover here at all, regardless of what the guest IP is. Considering the very serious tone of Blasphemous, I think it's weird that they thought it'd be a good idea for Miriam from Bloodstained to randomly show up and ask for the penitent one's help so she can get back to her world. I mean, you can totally ignore this extra content if you like, so I won't get too outraged over it. But I do think it undercuts the tone the game was going for. I, for one, wasn't really looking for any cameo appearances in Custodia. The actual content of the update is 5 new platforming challenges added in well-hidden locations throughout the game world. They essentially act as time trials where you need to navigate through some pretty challenging sections within the on-screen time limit. Unfortunately, these made a pretty bad first impression on me right from the outset because of a weird bug I encountered. There are a lot of ladders in Blasphemous, which is fine. And often you'll need to jump from ladder to ladder, or platform to ladder, so as to avoid a spiky death blow. This is never an issue throughout the game, you just hold up or down while jumping to a ladder and there you go. For some bizarre reason though, there's one specific ladder in the first Miriam challenge where you cannot attach to it by pressing up on the controller. You have to press down. There's not a single other ladder in the whole game where this is the case. This ladder's just fucked. I died so many times on it and it put me in a real pissy mood. Another thing I don't really like about these is that because the time limit is so tight, if you fail a jump, you're pretty much screwed and can't finish the challenge in time. The thing is, you can't just quickly restart these challenges, so you can either search for a death pit to kill yourself in, or just continue on to the end knowing you can't win. I'll be honest, I didn't even bother finishing all 5 challenges. I did the first 2 and tried the third a few times before calling it quits. I just didn't find them enjoyable or interesting and wasn't at all compelled by the character crossover to begin with. So now that I've had my moan, let's talk about the story of Blasphemous. Let me first point out that this game does not spoon feed you the plot at all. It's one of those games where it's very easy to play through the whole thing, beat the final boss, watch the ending cutscene, and then say to yourself, I have no fucking idea what that was all about. It's not that the game doesn't readily give you the information you need to piece it all together, it's just that it's kinda hard to take it all in and know what it means at the time. The NPCs have a very particular way of speaking, where unless you're already familiar with what the hell they're talking about, it's kinda hard to understand what the hell they're talking about. Also, as mentioned, Blasphemous takes a leaf from Dark Souls and has a ton of detailed item descriptions for nearly every item you can find. Reading these lore entries is really important if you want to have a proper understanding of the events of the past and what's happening in the present. Although we don't witness it in the actual game, the entire Brotherhood of the Silent Sorrow was wiped out by a warrior of the Anointed Legion named Chrysanta, carried out under the orders of His Holiness Escribar. You'll remember that Escribar was the same one who grew into a massive tree and then burned for 90 days, but after that event, he underwent an additional transformation, transforming into a red-skinned figure who continued to serve the miracle. The reason Escribar ordered the massacre of the Brotherhood of the Silent Sorrow was because he felt threatened by them, so chose to eliminate the potential threat to his power. Our protagonist himself was also one of those executed by Chrysanta. However, he is brought back to life by the miracle and escapes from the Brotherhood's former sanctuary. Meeting an odd figure named Deo Gracias outside, witness and narrator to the acts of the grievous miracle. He informs us that we seek the Cradle of Affliction, a holy relic found at the top of the pile of ash where Escribar sat upon his turned throne. To reach it, however, the penitent one must travel to and then ascend the Mother of Mothers, the central church, sequestered behind the locked door at the end of the Bridge of the Three Calvaries. To be admitted through the door, the penitent one must first carry out the 3 humiliations, possessing the wounds of attrition, contrition, and compunction. These are obtainable through communication with 3 holy golden visages, figures which exist on a different plane of existence. The 3 golden visages were the ones who witnessed firsthand the first miracle of the Twisted One, and afterwards ascended into a new form in a realm known as the Path of Endless Processions. At this point, the player can carry on across the Bridge of the Three Calvaries, but will have to battle a holy warrior named Esdras, who believes the penitent one seeks to work against His Holiness Escribar and the miracle. Esdras is believed by some to be mad, because although his revered sister Perpetua died many years ago, he claims he can still hear her voice, and frequently talks to her as if she's right there beside him. However, if the player chooses to seek the hidden shrine of Perpetua before crossing the Bridge of the Three Calvaries, we can communicate with her from beyond and receive an incomplete scapula. Showing this to Esdras allows the battle to be averted and he becomes our ally, seeing that we have proof of the blessing of his sister, Perpetua. From here we can regroup with Esdras back at the Brotherhood of the Silent Sorrow, at the very site where our sword, Mea Culpa, was born. Here Esdras gifts us a special key to be used at the Library of the Negated Words, found below the Mother of Mothers. We meet a watchman there, named Diosdado, who reveals the hidden door where our key may be used, enabling passage into a secret room housing the 4th holy visage. Instead of this one being present in a different realm of existence altogether, it's instead hidden in disgrace below the knot of the 3 words, blinded and branded a traitor. The knot of the 3 words is a holy tree which sprouted in the same location where the miracle first manifested itself within the Twisted One. Years after his death, the tree appeared, and every year from then on it yields a holy golden sap from its trunk and limbs. You see, although it's commonly believed that there were only 3 first-hand witnesses to the agony of the Twisted Father, there was in fact a 4th. However, the fourth witness was the only one to see past the miracle, instead comprehending its form and origin, a divine trinity, the High Wills, who we'll discuss more in due time. Because of the unacceptable claims of the fourth witness, they were branded a traitor, hidden away and blinded. We are tasked with finding the visage's stolen eyes, with one being found in the socket of the serpent Sierpes, and the other being possessed by Isidora, voice of the dead. Upon returning the golden eyes to the traitor visage, we are gifted with the apodictic heart of Mea Culpa, which we must equip before journeying up above the Mother of Mothers onto the Archcathedral rooftops. There, guarding His Holiness Escobar, waits Chrysanta of the Rapt Agony, our original murderer. After a long and challenging fight, with the power of the apodictic heart, the penitent one is able to literally break the chains which blind Chrysanta to the truth of the miracle. With her soul now wounded, she also travels back to the site of Mea Culpa in the sanctuary of the Brotherhood of the Silent Sorrow. Talking to her there, she tells us that all her life she has actually been serving that which controls the miracle, a holy trinity known as the High Wills, who dwell within the realm of the dream on the path of endless processions. As Chrysanta tells us, only a mortal soul of supreme suffering can gain access to this realm, and with that she passes on to us the fourth humiliation of the soul, the holy wound of abnegation. There is one more very important element required to allow us to ascend. We must become the custodian of sin. Located all around Custodia are confessor statues, holy sites where the citizens would come and confess the guilt in their hearts. I mentioned before that the penitent one's sword, Mea Culpa, is a special holy relic said to be capable of taking on all the guilt of Custodia. This is not meant figuratively, but literally. Back when we first met Deo Gracias, he gifted us with a simple thorn to be nailed into the effigy of the Twisted Father within the hilt of our sword. If we decide to destroy each of Custodia's 8 confessor statues, triumphing above the monsters thrown at us each time, the thorn in our hilt gradually transforms, first into a sprout, then a briar which becomes progressively more red with blood, then a vine, then finally into its final form, the Custodia of Sin. Now that he carries all of Custodia's vast guilt within his sword, as well as possessing the holy wound of abnegation, the penitent one may journey again onto the Archcathedral rooftop to meet and defeat Escobar, who transforms into his true form, the supposed last son of the miracle. Just after his defeat, we briefly see Escobar ascend up the path of holy processions on the other side of the dream, where the High Wills dwell. Our next task is to journey up the Mountain of Ash to the Cradle of Affliction. You see, if we attempt to do this without possessing the Custodia of Sin within our sword, Mea Culpa, the penitent one will gradually sink into the ash as he attempts to ascend, following the same fate as the rest. Nothing changes in Custodia if this ending comes to pass. The miracle carries on, and your penitence is over. This is ending A, considered the bad ending. If, however, you possess the Custodia of Sin but didn't do the quest to restore sight to the fourth golden visage, and you kill Esdras and Chrysanta instead of allying them to your cause, after defeating Escobar, the penitent one climbs the Mountain of Ash without trouble due to the weight of true guilt which has seeped into his heart. At the top of the ash, the penitent one sits upon the throne and impales himself with the guilt-ridden Mea Culpa, causing roots and branches to sprout from his body in a display reminiscent of the original agony and penance experienced by the Twisted One, first son of the miracle. The penitent one's sacrifice here breaks off the will of the miracle from Custodia, at least for now. He will not pass over to the realm of the dream, but remain in Custodia as the last son of the miracle, forever. At the very end of this sequence, we briefly see Chrysanta pull the sword from the body of the penitent one, although we can't know why. This is ending B, and before the Wounds of Eventide update added in late 2021, this was considered the best ending. If, however, we possess the Custodia of Sin, and we encounter the fourth golden visage and allied Esdras and Chrysanta to our cause, after climbing the Mountain of Ash, the Penitent One ascends up above the skies to the path of endless processions. This is the holy realm where the High Wills dwell, the Holy Trinity said to control the miracle. Before the High Wills, however, we again meet Escribar for the final time. His role now is to act as a sentinel, guarding the High Wills. This is the final encounter of the game, and we fight with the help of Chrysanta, who brings us back from death each time we're defeated in this realm, and who shields us from Escribar's attacks through the power of her holy crimson bindings. After a grueling battle, the Penitent One cleaves through Escribar's crimson form, allowing us to gain an audience with the High Wills, the supposed architects of the miracle. As we approach, we see the true form of the High Wills. They are three enormous disembodied heads with golden tears flowing freely from their perpetually weeping eyes. We discover that they are indeed the beings who control the miracle, feeding off the worship and adoration from mankind, aiming to make their rule and power eternal. They do also, however, tell us that this realm, this path of ancient processions, preceded their own existence. It's also somewhat hinted that although they control the miracle, determining when and how it so tortuously manifests itself in Custodia's inhabitants, that they didn't actually create the miracle, and instead are only manipulating its power for their own ends. By destroying His Holiness Escribar, as well as bringing guilt into this high realm, the High Wills curse us for eternity for this blasphemy, and for the ultimate blasphemy which is now to follow, that being the destruction of the High Wills. The High Wills are now dead and gone, and so finally is the hold of the miracle over Custodia. This means that all manifestations of the miracle will now fade to dust, and the monstrosities plaguing the land will disappear. This also, however, means the death of the Penitent One, who was only alive thanks to the power of the miracle itself. We see the form of the Twisted Father place a limb on the Penitent One's shoulder in deference and comfort, before the Father fades to dust in the wind. This is the Penitent One's dying vision. We then see his lifeless body being carried by Chrysanta and Deo Gracias to a final resting place, and who indeed could be deserving of rest more than the Penitent One, whose penitence is finally and truly at an end. After the credits roll, we witness one final event, seeing a beating heart-shaped womb fall and hang from the sky, with a sleeping figure being visible within. What does this mean? I suppose we'll have to wait until Blasphemous 2 to get some answers. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the plot of Blasphemous. It can be quite a difficult one to follow and piece together, and I'm sure I didn't answer every question, because I don't know all the answers. The decision to add in a whole extra ending was quite an odd one, and Ending C is now considered the canon ending, whereas before, Ending B was considered the most desirable one. But although Ending C is quite excellent, there's a part of me that just isn't fully down with it. You see, I think the miracle was one of the most interesting and terrifying concepts I've ever encountered, not just in a game, but in any piece of entertainment, book, film or show. One of the things that really made it so interesting, however, was how mysterious it was. I mean, it's right there in the intro cutscene as narrated by Deo Gracias. I love the idea of this terrifying holy force which can simply not be understood. The idea that the laws of nature no longer really mean anything, that a man can turn into a tree, that the guilt in a person's soul can spontaneously transform them into a living representation of torment, and that there's nothing anyone can do about it. This was how the miracle was depicted prior to the Wounds of Eventide update, but in putting a face to it, or 3 faces to be precise, a lot of that intrigue was lost. I feel that a good deal of that disturbing dread that Blasphemous cultivated throughout the game was also given away when all of a sudden the Penitent One and Chrysanta team up as this badass power duo, ascending to the heavens and killing a god, ending the miracle. I don't hate it or anything, but I really think ending B was preferable, because I don't think the miracle, or this story in general, was something that needed to be fully resolved. I didn't necessarily want to feel narratively fulfilled at the end of the game. Not this game, because this game was something different. I said it before, but I truly think this is one of the most disturbing games I've ever played for many reasons, but the new ending they added somewhat undermined that. But hey, let me be clear that I didn't hate it, it just didn't quite sit right with me. I'm glad as shit that they're making a Blasphemous 2 as well, and I'm very interested in where they decide to take it. Blasphemous is one of my favourite games of all time. The Game Kitchen truly achieved something special here with this setting, and I find it to be uniquely disturbing. It's a fantastic game, overflowing with creativity, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. As always, cheers for watching.